We're in John chapter 21. We find ourselves after Easter, in truth, and the celebration of Jesus' resurrection, in my humble opinion, the high point of the Christian calendar. And I think it's legitimate to ask the question, what next? I'd like to partially answer that question by looking at the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus, the literal what next for the original disciples. If I have counted correctly, there are 13 post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. We won't cover all 13 this morning, so you can just relax. We'll get out of here before 3 o'clock. From the first one to Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome on the resurrection morning, found in Mark chapter 16. To the last, to John on the island of Patmos, found in Revelation chapter 1. All of these are surprising and enlightening. But I've chosen one, which is either the third or fourth appearance, depending on how you count them. It is to Peter and 6 other disciples hanging out near the Sea of Tiberias in Galilee. And just a note of clarification, the Sea of Tiberias is the Sea of Galilee. They changed the name when toward the end of the first century, when the second Roman emperor came to be, Tiberius, and they built a city for him there on the west coast, the Sea of Galilee, and renamed it the Sea of Tiberias because, well, he's the emperor. He can do what he wants. Just wanted to clear that up because even when I'm reading, I'm going, wait, Sea of Galilee, Sea of Tiberias? So we're beginning in verse 1 in chapter 21. Afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas called Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. If you are of that ilk, would you underline together, just as a reminder to yourself? I'm going out to fish, Simon Peter told them. And they said, we'll go with you. So they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing, which is often what I do when I go hunting or fishing, nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples didn't realize it was Jesus. This is the third or fourth time he's appeared. You think maybe they might be suspicious about strangers in their midst, but apparently they're not. And he calls out to them, friends, haven't you any fish? Now, apparently the way he says this, if you're a Greek scholar, which I'm not, but I can read commentaries, is that this was like more like a master to his pupils or a god to his subjects kind of words. And it's kind of like the strangers asking them in kind of a strange tone, haven't you got any fish? No, they answered. He said, throw your net on the right side of the boat and you'll find some. Notice he doesn't say, try the right side or think about, he just tells them, throw your net on the right side of the boat and you will find some. When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved, John, if you're not following along with the Gospels, said to Peter, it's the Lord. As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, it is the Lord, he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he'd taken it off, I guess to be in the water to fish, and jumped into the water. There's some debate about this wording here. Why would you get fully clothed and go jump in the water? It's a question. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to throw my outer coat on and jump in the water. Anyway, he was apparently not dressed well for Jesus' appearance or anybody else's appearance, and he thought, I better put something on. Anyway, so he gets there. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. I get the scene. It takes a while to get coals, right? Coals just don't start right away, right? If you try to do your marshmallows too soon, what happens? Oh, yeah. If you like burnt marshmallows, that's the time to put your marshmallows in when the flames are happening, because you'll get the black on the outside and the gooey stuff on the inside all over your hands. But he had coals. he had coals already going. So he had some preparation going. It was already, or was a miraculous fire? I don't know. But he was there prepared for them with fish already on the grill and some bread. Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish you have just caught. Excuse me. Simon Peter climbed aboard and dragged the net ashore. So he didn't really make it much earlier to shore than the other disciples, which is kind of interesting that he wanted to get there first, and I'm not sure if he really did or not. It was full of large fish. The scripture tells us 153. Do we have any accountants here this morning? Do we have any accountants here this morning? Because you count for a living. I'm just wondering who counted 153 fish. They're fishing. They catch nothing all night. They come to the shore. The stranger, at first, tells them to throw the net on the other side. They do, and whew, the net is full. But it's not breaking, which is good. And somebody in the midst of all this, after having identified that this is Jesus, stops to count to 153. Which just makes me believe that Christians are kind of weird people. We want to know exactly how big is this miracle. I want to quantify it. I want to calculate it so I can put it in the books. Who knows? Next week we might have 154. Be a bigger miracle. Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast. None of the disciples dared ask him, who are you? They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread, and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time Jesus appears to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. Peter says, I'm going out to fish. Well, at the extremes, Peter is either abandoning his faith or doing the only thing he knows to do rather than sit around doing nothing. I've heard this taught both ways. Since this is following two post-resurrection appearances of Jesus, it makes abandonment of his faith seem much less likely than either being simply hungry or just doing something to profitably occupy the time. In any case, for good or bad, Peter leads the other disciples. Pointing out, I think, that some of you are leaders. Somebody's looking at somebody right now. I can't see you because the lights make you just silhouettes, which is kind of weird. Some of you are leaders whether you want to be or not. And others will follow you whether you're correct or mistaken. That leadership may be most critical in the down times we experience when it seems the Lord is not as evident as we'd like him to be. These are those pauses in our Christian experience that occur for us personally and church-wide. During the search for a senior pastor here, we as a community experienced one of these pauses. Or did nobody else beside me say, Jesus, are you paying attention? Did we get lost in the shuffle? There's a lot of churches and a lot of people. Maybe I'm the only one. I'll take the blame. I'll be the sacrificial goat for you. But that was a pause of sorts, wasn't it? At least I felt it was. And it was a frustrating pause at some junctures. Just like, okay, it's been a month, it's been 2 months, it's been 3 months. We'll talk a little bit more about what we do during those pauses. Early the next morning, the disciples are coming into shore having caught nothing when someone on the shore calls out to them, friends, haven't you any fish? No, they answered, the lesson is still not finished. He said, throw your net on the right side of the boat and you'll find some. When they did, they were unable to haul the net because of the large number of fish. Jesus, still unknown to the disciples, gives a command that they obey, and success, a lot of fish. Then John says to Peter, "It's the Lord." Peter throws on his outer garment, leaps into the water, and swims to the shore, leaving the others to row the boat in. Come on, you guys, bring the fish. I'm going to go see Jesus. When the boat arrives, Peter jumps back on the boat, grabs the net, and drags it to the shore. Is somebody thinking about themselves here a little more than the others? Maybe. Jesus is waiting with fish, cooking on the coals and some bread. He tells the disciples, "Bring some of the fish you've just caught." And Jesus says, "Come and have breakfast." Then a curious, awkward moment. No one asks, "Who are you?" Because John writes, they knew it was the Lord. At that point, it is probably easier to just eat breakfast than say, "Jesus? Is that you?" Some things are still not clear to Peter. Primarily that he continues to put himself forward before the other disciples. He leaps off the boat, putting himself first, but apparently doesn't arrive sooner than shore than them anyway. Then he grabs the net that everyone else helped fill and drags it to shore himself. Apparently ignorant that Jesus somehow already has fish to eat. After all the busyness, Jesus serves them. He feeds them breakfast. In verse 15, when they'd finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said. "You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." The first of Jesus' questions to him. Second question, again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me?" Same question. But he doesn't add more than these. He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Answers the same way. Jesus says, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he answered differently. "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. I tell you the truth, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." And then John adds the explanation. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to Peter, "Follow me." After the awkward interlude on the beach, I can just imagine the disciples. I like to imagine what was happening. I know it's not inspired necessarily, but I like to fill out the blanks. There's an awkward interlude, and I have to imagine the disciples were asking each other, "Who is this? It's Jesus, right? Are you sure?" "No, I'm not asking. You ask him." Jesus turns to Peter and asks him, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." From the first question he asks Peter, Peter knows something's not quite right. It was Jesus who changed Simon's name to Peter, recorded for us in John chapter 1, verse 42. But now, something has happened in the interim, hasn't it? Between then, when Jesus changed his name, chapter 1, and now he's with Jesus on the beach. And he doesn't call him Peter. He calls him Simon, son of John, which was his original name. And the question is Jesus subtly asking or stating that Peter is not with him as he was when Jesus renamed him? I do believe that Jesus is asking Peter, without saying it directly, are you still with me? Then Jesus asks again, Simon, son of John, do you truly love me? But it doesn't add the more than these. And the more than these probably refers to the other disciples. If you're in a discipleship Bible study, you can use that first question, more than these, to discern your focus in your life of discipleship before the Lord. We're just going to follow the passage today. Do you love me? Second question. Do you truly love me? He answered, same way as before, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And Jesus said, take care of my sheep. There are some subtle differences in the verbs in the Greek and then the wording. I'm not a Greek scholar, if you didn't know that already. I'm a pharmacist. But I know a little Greek prefixes and suffixes, but the rest of it kind of eludes me. But there are some differences, and smarter people than me have written it down in English so I can understand it. There's some changes that happen. There's some movement that happens during these questions. From feed my sheep to shepherd my sheep to a phrase that combines them both in Jesus' answers to Peter. As well, the word for love seems to be lofty in the first two. Do you love me? Do you truly love me? And Peter responds, I love you. Maybe not as much as I should, but I love you. And it's not an all or none kind of thing. It's not a 1 and a 10, but there's some differences here between the words for love. The third time, interestingly enough, Jesus asks Peter, do you love me? Using the same word that Peter used. So Jesus is willing to meet Peter where Peter is. That's very clear. And the third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And he said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Peter is softening a bit. Jesus is meeting him. Peter's humbling himself a bit. Lord, you know all things. Instead of saying, Lord, you know I love you. However petulant it might have been. I don't think it was, but it could have been. Jesus meets Peter at the level he can love him, and Peter responds by saying, Lord, you know all things. I think I'm starting to get it, Lord. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep, which is that combination of both shepherding and feeding. Peter's love for Jesus is challenged 3 times in this passage. First, Jesus asks me who loves him more than these. Probably, like I said, probably the other disciples. Which relationship, Jesus asks, is the most important to you? Peter responds, says, yes, Lord, you know that it's you. Second, Jesus asks again if Peter truly loves him. Peter also responds in kind, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And Jesus says, take care of my sheep. And at the third instance, both Jesus' question, Peter's answer, Jesus' response are changed ever so slightly. Do you love me? Not do you truly love me? Lord, do you know all things? You know that I love you. Feed my sheep. The third time it says Peter was hurt. Peter cannot be so dull so as not to remember his 3 denials of Jesus, recorded for us in Mark 14. And that these 3 exchanges undoubtedly hinge on Peter's earlier failure. There were some hallmarks in Peter's life. I think being called by Jesus. Second, the exchange when his name is changed and he declares that Jesus is the Christ. And Jesus says, you'll all fall away. Remember what Peter says? Oh, all of them, yes, Lord, but not me. I will die for you. And Jesus looks at Peter and says, before the cock crows twice, you'll deny me 3 times. That had to be the low moment of Peter's life, at least for my estimation. And now Jesus is kind of digging that up again with 3 questions about whether Peter really loves him. It had to sting. Jesus is getting at a surgical procedure to get into Peter's life, because that denial would otherwise completely undo him. Jesus needed to deal with it, even though it was uncomfortable, even though it was painful, even though it says Peter was hurt. The Lord's not above hurting us to uncover those old things that hamstring us into the present. Peter now has more humility and a greater recognition of Jesus' authority. Lord, you know all things. So Peter's coming to recognize, yes, Lord. You know all things. You know that I love you. And Jesus doesn't say you're a lost cause, does he? All 3 times he gives him something to do. To feed my lambs, to shepherd my sheep, to feed and shepherd my flock. In the face of Peter's failure, Jesus still puts him back in place and reappoints him to ministry. Maybe not momentous as far as these changes are in the statements 1, 2, and 3. But it creates a more full understanding of what it takes to shepherd God's people. And then Jesus adds Peter's future. When you were young, you went where you wanted. When you're old, you go where you don't want to go. Feed my lambs, shepherd my sheep, take care of my flock. And there'll be some unpleasantness toward the end. Then Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This was the one who had leaned back against Jesus' supper and had said, Lord, who's going to betray you? The apostle, the disciple, John. When Peter saw him, he asked, Lord, what about him? Because if I have a kind of grisly fate awaiting me, what's going to happen to him? I want to know. Jesus answered, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? And I think, forgive me if I'm misquoting you, Lord, but I believe he said it just that way. Peter's kind of getting it. He's getting his responses right. He's recognizing Jesus' authority and divine power, which he does in the passage from 2 Peter that Meg read for us this morning. Different Peter. Something's happened between the time he denied Jesus, these questions, and him writing those books. If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me. Okay. You must follow me. Because of this, the rumor spread among the brothers that this disciple would not die. John explains, but Jesus did not say he would not die. He only said, if I wanted to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? So there's no promise of John's immortality, John himself is saying. Peter just can't help himself. Just when it seems he might be getting it, he considers his future that Jesus has just outlined, and he looks at John and says, "But what about him?" Jesus clearly says, "Not your problem what he does. You have to follow me. Get your focus right," he tells Peter. You're constantly looking around. Stop doing that. Get your focus right. In this passage, there are lots of things to learn, more than I can reasonably teach from my experience, education, and training. But let me point out a few. In the face of difficult times, the disciples mostly stayed together in community. There's some places where Thomas wasn't there that time that Jesus appeared. Jesus still appeared later so he could put his hands in his hands and his feet and side. Yeah. I think I'd just rather have faith and believe, wouldn't you? Mostly they were together. And I want to encourage you that in those times where Jesus seems not to be exactly where you want him to be, it's better to be together than alone. Second, Jesus was faithful to meet them where he said at their need. Back in Mark 14, Jesus had told them before his crucifixion, "I will go ahead of you to Galilee." And so that's why they'd gone to Galilee. Now they're just kind of hanging out, might as well fish. Third, Jesus points out their poverty. "Hey, you got any fish?" "No, we've got nothing." And maybe some things that he said to them, recorded for us in John 15:5, that they could do nothing without him. Jesus said to his disciples, "Apart from me, you can do nothing." And that fourth, when they follow Jesus' direction, amazing things happen. You start to get it right, amazing things happen. 153 somethings. And even though Peter's reinstatement with Jesus was painful, Jesus did not give up on him. And he won't give up on you either. Are you at a pause in your Christian life? Don't be alone. Hear that word this morning. Don't be alone. Are you willing to hear Jesus ask you the difficult questions you need to hear from him? Have you been avoiding that conversation with him? Prayer's really easy when it's one way. Jesus starts talking about, "Time to go, Lord. Look at the time. How much do you want to be reappointed by Jesus? We all reach places in our faith where we have a crisis, a big one, a small one. And sometimes we pause there and I don't know where to go next, Lord. This morning, I'd just like to ask you to take a second and consider whether or not it's time for you to allow Jesus to do his spiritual surgery on you. To uncover that place of hurt, that place of crisis, that place of your denial, maybe. And to examine it in the light of his love. And reappoint you to feed his lambs. To shepherd the sheep. To take your place in the care of God's people.